The ancient pickup truck lurched to a halt on that desolate Oklahoma back road, dust swirling in the summer heat like ghosts. Inside, Frank Miller's weathered hands clutched the steering wheel, knuckles white, jaw clenched. The barking wouldn't stop. "Shut up!" he roared, but the German Shepherd puppy in the truck bed only yipped louder, excited by his voice. Frank's breathing quickened as the barking morphed in his mind. No longer a puppy, but the snarling of attack dogs from long ago, from a jungle he'd spent 50 years trying to forget. The medication bottles in his pocket felt heavy, all empty now. With deliberate movements, Frank stepped out and stalked to the truck bed. The puppy, all paws and ears, wagged its tail, oblivious to the darkness behind the old man's eyes. Frank grabbed it roughly, memories flooding back with each bark. "This ends now," he whispered. 20 miles away, the thunderous roar of motorcycles shattered the countryside silence as the lost riders crested a hill, leather-clad figures moving as one. None could have predicted how their paths would cross with Frank's, nor the painful truths that single act of cruelty would unearth. Frank Miller hadn't always been a bitter old man. At 72, his once powerful frame had bent under the weight of decades, but his eyes still carried sparks of the young soldier who'd served as a dog handler in Vietnam. His small farm outside Millbrook, Oklahoma, had become his fortress, isolated and crumbling, much like its owner. The nightmares had gotten worse lately. Frank would wake drenched in sweat, hearing phantom barking and the screams of men long dead. The VA doctor had increased his medication again, but the pills stayed mostly untouched in amber bottles lined up on his bedside table like silent sentinels. When his daughter Emily had dropped off her kids for a weekend visit last month, they'd brought the puppy as a surprise. "Something to keep you company, Grandpa," they'd said with innocent smiles, not understanding how the German Shepherd's resemblance to the military dogs from his past would tear open wounds Frank had spent a lifetime trying to cauterize. 40 miles away, in a roadhouse on the edge of town, the lost riders gathered around their usual table. Dakota Johnson, their 65-year-old leader, commanded respect without raising his voice. The silver-habled former Marine had founded the group 15 years ago, creating a brotherhood for veterans who found more comfort on the open road than in the society they'd once protected. "Another round for my brothers," Dakota called to the bartender, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile beneath his gray beard. Beside him sat Roscoe Thompson, a mountain of a man whose intimidating appearance belied his gentle nature. At 59, Roscoe's massive hands, capable of bending metal, now trembled slightly when he was alone, remembering the car crash that had taken his wife and son 8 years earlier. His boy had loved dogs, especially German Shepherds. Sheriff Mike Callahan watched the bikers from across the bar with narrowed eyes. He'd had run-ins with the Lost Riders before, mostly minor infractions, but their vigilante reputation made him uneasy. The sheriff nursed his coffee, unaware that in less than 24 hours their paths would cross in ways none of them could anticipate. Meanwhile, a small black and tan puppy shivered on a deserted road, confused and abandoned, its significance to all these lives still unknown. The German Shepherd puppy had arrived in a cardboard box with holes punched in the sides and a blue ribbon tied in a crooked bow. Frank's grandchildren, Timmy and Sarah, had presented it with gap-toothed smiles and eyes brimming with hope. "His name is Max," 7-year-old Timmy had announced proudly. "Mom says he'll keep you company." Frank had tried to refuse, had opened his mouth to say the words, but the disappointment that immediately clouded their faces stopped him cold. Instead, he'd forced a smile and accepted the squirming bundle, ignoring the way his heart hammered against his ribs when the puppy licked his weathered hand. "Thanks, kids," he'd managed, his voice a rusty hinge. He's real nice." That first night, Max had slept at the foot of Frank's bed, his tiny snores a strange comfort in the old farmhouse that had known only silence for years. Frank had even reached down once to stroke the puppy's soft fur, remembering another dog from another time. He'd fallen asleep without taking his usual whiskey nightcap, but by the third day things began to change. The puppy barked at shadows, at birds, at the mailman. Sharp, staccato barks that sliced through Frank's fragile calm. Each yap sent him back to the jungle, to the military dogs straining at their leashes, signaling danger moments before an ambush. Frank would find himself pressed against walls, breath coming in short gasps, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Shut up, damn you," he'd whisper, hands shaking as he fumbled for his pills. But Max didn't understand. He was just a puppy doing what puppies do. By the second week, Frank had stopped sleeping altogether. Dark circles rimmed his bloodshot eyes as he moved through his daily routines like a ghost. The prescription bottles emptied faster than they should have. When he called the VA for early refills, they denied him. Protocol, they said. Frank knew what that meant. They thought he was just another broken-down vet looking for a fix. The morning Frank snapped began like any other. He'd loaded Max into his pickup truck for a supply run into town. The puppy had been particularly energetic, barking incessantly at passing cars, at cows in the fields, at nothing at all. Each bark was a nail driving into Frank's skull, each yip a trigger pulling him back to moments he'd spent decades trying to bury. "Stop it," Frank had growled, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Just stop it." But Max didn't stop, couldn't stop, and somewhere between the farmhouse and Miller's Creek the thin thread holding Frank's sanity together unraveled completely. The memories flooded back, not in fragments this time, but in a torrent. The German shepherd straining at its leash, the warning bark, the explosion, the screams of his squad mates, his own hands releasing the dog's leash and running in the opposite direction while the others... Frank slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt on the deserted county road, dust billowing around them like the smoke from that day. For a moment he sat perfectly still, breathing hard, tears streaming down his leathery cheeks. Then, with mechanical movements, he got out and walked around to the truck bed. Max wagged his tail, tongue lolling, innocent and trusting. The sight made Frank's chest hurt in a way he couldn't articulate. This wasn't just about the barking anymore. This was about what the dog represented. All his failures, his cowardice, his shame. "I can't do this anymore," Frank whispered, voice breaking. "I just can't." With hands that had once gently handled military working dogs, Frank roughly grabbed Max by the scrub. The puppy yelped in surprise but didn't struggle, still trusting the human who had fed and sheltered him. Frank walked to the side of the road, his movements jerky, as though his body was fighting itself. "You'll be better off without me," he said, though whether to the dog or himself wasn't clear. Then, with a strangled sob, Frank threw the puppy away from him into the ditch alongside the road. Max landed with a yelp of pain and confusion. He immediately tried to scramble back toward Frank, his little legs working furiously in the dust, whimpering now instead of barking. The sound was almost worse. Frank didn't look back. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove away, tears blinding him so badly he nearly went into the ditch himself. In his rear-view mirror he could see Max trying to follow, getting smaller and smaller until he was just a dark spot on the sun-baked road. 20 minutes later, the small puppy had collapsed in the middle of the road, panting heavily, dehydrated under the merciless Oklahoma sun. His trusting nature had been betrayed, but still, he lifted his head at each passing vehicle, expecting, hoping, it would be Frank returning for him. Instead, it was the distant rumble of motorcycles that answered his silent plea. The sound grew from a whisper to a roar as a pack of riders appeared on the horizon, heat waves distorting their approach. The lost riders were returning from a memorial run for a fallen Vietnam veteran, their formation tight, their chrome gleaming in the midday sun. Dakota led the pack, his mind still on the service they'd attended. Another one gone, another brother who'd made it through the war only to lose the longer battle at home. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the small shape in the road ahead. Almost. Shit! Dakota swerved hard, his motorcycle fishtailing as he narrowly avoided the puppy. Behind him, the other riders followed suit, engines growling as they maneuvered around the unexpected obstacle. Brakes squealed, dust flew. When the chaos settled, the bikers had formed a protective circle around the collapsed puppy. Dakota killed his engine and dismounted, removing his helmet with hands that had once assembled rifles blindfolded. "What the hell?" he muttered, crouching down beside the trembling animal. Roscoe was already there, his massive frame incongruous as he gently reached for the puppy. "Easy, little fella," he said, his voice as soft as summer rain. "Nobody's gonna hurt you now." "He's been dumped," Roscoe said, gently lifting the exhausted German shepherd puppy. His massive hands, adorned with faded tattoos and silver rings, cradled the small animal with surprising tenderness. "Poor little guy's dehydrated. Probably been out here for hours." Dakota dismounted his Harley, removing his helmet to reveal a face weathered by decades of sun and hardship. His gray beard couldn't hide the tightening of his jaw as he surveyed the scene. "Who the hell dumps a puppy on a county road in this heat?" The other riders had formed a protective semicircle around Roscoe and the dog. They were an imposing group, 15 men in their 50s and 60s, clad in leather vests displaying the lost riders' insignia, their motorcycles gleaming in the harsh sunlight. To anyone passing by, they might have looked dangerous, but the gentle way they regarded the puppy told a different story. "We need to get him to a vet," said Mac, a former Army medic who now worked as an EMT. He approached and knelt beside Roscoe, gently checking the puppy's gums. "He's pretty dehydrated. Got some scrapes, too. Looks like he might have been thrown." A collective growl rose from the group of men. If there was one thing the lost riders couldn't abide, it was cruelty to those who couldn't defend themselves, whether children, the elderly, or animals. "Nearest vet's in Millbrook," Dakota said, already pulling out his phone. "About 15 miles. Roscoe, you take the pup in your sidecar. I'll call ahead." As Dakota made the call, Roscoe carefully poured water from his canteen into his cup palm, offering it to the puppy. Max lapped weakly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. "That's it, little buddy," Roscoe murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The massive biker's eyes glistened suspiciously as he watched the puppy drink. "You're going to be just fine now." 20 minutes later, the thunderous procession of motorcycles pulled into the parking lot of Millbrook Veterinary Clinic, drawing stares from everyone inside. Dr. Sarah Jenkins was waiting at the door, having received Dakota's urgent call. Her eyebrows rose at the sight of the leather-clad bikers, but her professional demeanor never faltered. "Bring him in quickly," she directed, holding the door as Roscoe hurried in with the puppy cradled against his chest. Inside the examination room, Dr. Jenkins moved efficiently, checking vital signs and administering fluids. "He's young, maybe 3 months. German shepherd, good bloodlines from the look of him." She frowned as she found the abrasions on his side and paws. "These are consistent with being thrown or falling from a moving vehicle. You found him on County Road 22? Dakota nodded grimly. "Someone dumped him there, left him to die." Dr. Jenkins's expression darkened. "Unfortunately, I see this too often." She continued her examination, then paused, her brow furrowing. "That's interesting. What is it?" Roscoe asked anxiously. "He has a microchip." She ran the scanner over the puppy again. "It's not a standard pet registration chip. This is military grade." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. "Military?" Dakota echoed, exchanging glances with his brothers. "Most of the lost riders were veterans themselves." Dr. Jenkins nodded, typing the chip number into her computer. "It's part of a special breeding program. This puppy is descended from military working dogs. He was being raised for the Canine Companions for Veterans program, specifically trained to help veterans with PTSD." Roscoe's massive hand instinctively moved to stroke the puppy's head. "So he's not just any dog. He's meant to help vets." "Exactly," Dr. Jenkins confirmed. "According to this, his name is Max. He was part of a litter being raised for the program." She frowned at the screen. "But there's no record of him being placed yet. He shouldn't have been with a civilian at all." Dakota's weathered face darkened. "So we've got a stolen military service dog puppy, dumped on a county road to die." His fists clenched at his sides. "Doc, how soon before he's stable enough to leave your care?" Dr. Jenkins considered the question. "I'd like to keep him overnight for IV fluids, but he should be fine to release tomorrow. No permanent damage, thankfully. He'll need a proper home, though." "He's got one," Roscoe said firmly, surprising even himself with the declaration. "With me." Dakota nodded his approval, then turned to the remaining bikers who had crowded into the waiting room. "Brothers, we've got work to do. Someone in this county has committed a crime against one of our own, a dog meant to help veterans. I want to know who it was." The investigation began immediately. The Lost Riders split into pairs, visiting gas stations, convenience stores, and local hangouts along County Road 22. They showed pictures of Max, taken at the vet clinic, asking if anyone had seen the puppy before. For 2 days they came up empty. Then, on the third day, Mac and another rider named Booker struck gold at Miller's Gas and Grocery, a small establishment 10 miles from where they'd found Max. The young attendant, Jimmy, recognized the puppy immediately. "Yeah, I seen that dog before. Cute little fella. Was in the back of old man Miller's truck about 2 weeks ago, barking up a storm." "Old man Miller?" Booker inquired, keeping his voice casual despite the excitement building inside him. "Frank Miller. Got a farm out past the creek. Crusty old Vietnam vet, keeps to himself mostly." Jimmy leaned in confidentially. "He was in here yesterday acting weird. Asked if I'd seen any bikers asking about a dog. When I said no, he seemed relieved, then got all boastful. Said he'd taken care of that yapping problem by dumping the mud on the side of the road a couple weeks back." Jimmy shook his head in disgust. "I was going to report him, but honestly, I was afraid to. Miller's got a mean streak." Mac and Booker exchanged glances. They had their man. Back at their clubhouse, a converted barn outside town that served as the Lost Riders' headquarters, Dakota listened to the report with growing anger. But something about the name nagged at him. "Frank Miller," he repeated slowly. "Vietnam vet." He walked to a shelf and pulled down an old photo album, flipping through pages yellowed with age. He stopped suddenly, his finger resting on a black and white photograph of a much younger man in military uniform, standing next to a German shepherd. "Jesus Christ," Dakota whispered. "What is it, brother?" Roscoe asked, looking up from where he sat with Max curled in his lap. Dakota's face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Frank Miller. I know that name." He turned the album so the others could see. "He was my father's cousin. They served together in Vietnam. Dad always said Frank was a hero. Saved his whole unit once with his dog." The revelation hung in the air, changing everything and nothing at the same time. "Well," Roscoe said finally, scratching behind Max's ears, "looks like this just got complicated." Dakota closed the album with a decisive snap. "Doesn't change what he did to Max, but maybe it changes how we handle it." He looked around at his brothers, his expression grim. "Tomorrow we pay Cousin Frank a visit, but first we need to know exactly what we're dealing with." That night, while Max slept safely at the clubhouse under Roscoe's watchful eye, Dakota and 3 others conducted surveillance on Frank Miller's farm, a dilapidated property with peeling paint and overgrown fields. Through binoculars, they watched the old man move about his kitchen, talking to himself, gesturing wildly at times. They saw him take pills with whiskey, saw him startle at shadows. "That ain't just a mean old man," Mac observed quietly. That's a man fighting demons." Dakota lowered his binoculars, his expression troubled. "Demons or not, he left an innocent animal to die. We need to make sure he never does anything like that again." By dawn, they had formulated a plan, one that would send shockwaves through the entire county. The Lost Riders didn't rush their investigation. Dakota insisted they gather every possible piece of information before confronting Frank Miller. "We do this right," he told his brothers during their planning session. "This isn't just about a dog anymore." Over the next 2 days, the bikers discreetly pieced together Frank Miller's story. They spoke with locals who remembered him, combed through public records at the county courthouse, and even reached out to veteran contacts who might have served with him. Max was thriving under Roscoe's care. The puppy had gained weight, his coat beginning to shine with health. At night he slept curled against Roscoe's side, and during the day he was never far from the big man's heels. Watching them together, Dakota couldn't help but see how the dog had already begun healing something in Roscoe that had been broken since the accident. "He's got nightmares," Roscoe confided to Dakota one evening as they sat on the clubhouse porch. The other riders had gone home, leaving just the two of them, sharing a quiet beer. "Whimpers in his sleep like he's scared. Then he wakes up and looks around like he can't believe where he is." Dakota nodded, watching Max chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Animals remember trauma, same as people." "Speaking of trauma," Roscoe said, his voice lowering, "what'd you find out about your cousin?" Dakota took a long pull from his beer before answering. "Frank Joseph Miller, 68 years old, enlisted in the Army in 72. Served in Vietnam as a dog handler with the 47th Scout Dog Platoon." He paused, his weathered face solemn in the fading light. "Received a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star with Valor. Honorably discharged in 75. A decorated veteran dumps a service dog puppy," Roscoe mused. "Doesn't add up. There's more." Dakota pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Called in a favor with Jake over at the VA. Frank's been in treatment for severe PTSD for decades. Has prescriptions for heavy-duty meds. Misses most of his appointments, lives alone since his wife died in '08. Has a daughter who lives in Tulsa. Couple of grandkids who visit sometimes." Roscoe's brow furrowed. "You think the PTSD explains what he did to Max?" "Doesn't excuse it," Dakota said firmly, "but might explain it. Jake said Frank was a dog handler whose unit was hit hard, lost his dog and most of his team in an ambush." He hesitated. "There's always been rumors about that day. Some say Frank broke, abandoned his post. Nothing was ever proven." "Jesus," Roscoe muttered. "So, a German Shepherd puppy barking might trigger flashbacks." "Exactly." Dakota folded the paper back into his pocket. "Look, I'm not saying we give him a pass. What he did to Max was cruel, no question, but we need to approach this differently than we would some asshole who hurt an animal for fun." Across town, Sheriff Mike Callahan was finishing paperwork when his deputy, Rick Simmons, knocked on his office door. "Come in," Callahan called, not looking up from his desk. "Sheriff, got something you might want to hear." Rick closed the door behind him. "My cousin works at the vet clinic. Says the Lost Riders brought in a German Shepherd puppy a few days back. Claims it was dumped on County Road 22. Callahan looked up, his interest piqued. "The Lost Riders playing animal rescue now?" "That's not all," Rick continued. "They've been asking around town about who the dog belonged to. Word is they're focused on Frank Miller. You know, the old vet out past Wilson Creek." Callahan leaned back in his chair, a frown deepening the lines in his forehead. "I know Frank. Troubled man, but keeps to himself mostly. Why would those bikers be interested in him? Rumor is he's the one who dumped the dog, and you know how the writers feel about animal abuse. People are saying they're planning something." The sheriff stood, reaching for his hat. "Last thing we need is vigilante justice in my county. I better go have a word with Dakota Johnson before this gets out of hand." The following morning, Sheriff Callahan pulled his cruiser into the gravel lot of the roadhouse where the lost riders often gathered. Inside, he found Dakota at the bar, nursing a coffee. "Sure," Dakota acknowledged without turning. "Figured you'd be stopping by." "Word travels fast," Callahan said, sliding onto the stool beside him. "Heard you boys are taking an interest in Frank Miller." Dakota sipped his coffee before responding. "Just concerned citizens, Sheriff. Looking out for abandoned animals." "Uh-huh." Callahan didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "And it has nothing to do with planning some frontier justice for the man you think dumped that dog? Did I say that?" "You didn't have to." The sheriff leaned closer. "Listen, Dakota. I've given you and your boys plenty of slack over the years because underneath all that leather and attitude, you do some good for this community. But if you're planning to harass Frank Miller—" "Harass?" Dakota turned to face him fully. "Is that what you call it when someone investigates animal cruelty? Because last I checked, abandoning a dog is illegal in this state." "Then file a report like a normal citizen. Let me handle it." Dakota's laugh was without humor. "Like you handled those kids who were torturing cats last year? Slap on the wrist and community service picking up trash?" Callahan's face flushed. "That was different. They were minors. And Frank's a respected veteran, right? Another reason to look the other way?" Dakota shook his head. "Not happening, Sheriff. We found that puppy half dead on the road. A special puppy, by the way. Bred for a veterans support program. Now we know who did it, and we're not backing off." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "What exactly are you planning, Dakota?" "Nothing illegal, if that's what you're worried about." Dakota finished his coffee and stood. "But Frank Miller needs to understand the consequences of his actions, one way or another." As Callahan watched Dakota walk away, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Despite their differences, he'd always known Dakota to be a man of his word. If he said they weren't planning anything illegal, that was probably true. But the Lost Riders had their own code, their own sense of justice. What worried the sheriff most was the intensity in Dakota's eyes when he spoke about Frank. This wasn't just another cause for the Riders. This was personal. Back at his farm, Frank Miller was living a nightmare of his own making. He hadn't slept properly since dumping Max 2 weeks earlier. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the puppy's confused face, heard the yelp of pain when he hit the ground. These images mingled with older, darker memories. The German shepherd from his unit, Ajax, barking frantically before the world exploded into chaos, the screams of men he'd called brothers, his own cowardice as he ran. Frank knew he'd made a terrible mistake with Max. The moment he'd driven away, regret had crashed over him like a wave. But pride and shame had kept him from turning back. Now remorse ate at him like acid, intensifying the PTSD symptoms he'd fought for decades. He'd run out of his medication a week ago and couldn't face going into town to refill the prescriptions. Instead, he self-medicated with whiskey, which only made the nightmares worse. His house had become a reflection of his mental state. Dishes piled in the sink, mail unopened on the table, blinds drawn against the daylight. When the phone rang, he jumped, nearly dropping the glass in his hand. He rarely received calls. His daughter Emily checked in occasionally, but they'd argued during her last visit when she'd discovered he no longer had the puppy her children had given him. "Where's Max, Dad?" she'd demanded, her face flushing with anger that reminded him painfully of her mother. "Gave him to a family down the road," he'd lied, unable to meet her eyes. "Better for him. Couldn't take care of him proper." She hadn't believed him, he could tell from the way she'd studied his face. But she hadn't pressed further, just packed the kids up sooner than planned and left with a cold goodbye. Another relationship damaged beyond repair by his inability to confront his demons. The phone continued to ring. Finally, Frank snatched it up. "Miller," he barked. "Mr. Miller," the voice was unfamiliar, deep and gravelly, "just calling to let you know we found something you lost." Frank's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what you did on County Road 22 2 weeks ago." The line went dead. Frank stood frozen, the receiver clutched in his trembling hand. How could anyone know? There'd been no witnesses. The road had been deserted, unless the puppy had been found. A sick feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just about breaking the law. If people found out what he'd done, it would confirm what many in town already thought about him, that he was a broken, cruel old man. The shame would be unbearable. Frank spent that night pacing his kitchen, jumping at every sound, peering through the blinds at the empty driveway. By morning, exhaustion had overtaken his fear, and he fell into a fitful sleep in his armchair. He awoke to the sound of vehicles on his property. Heart pounding, he grabbed his shotgun from behind the door and inched to the window. What he saw made him drop the weapon in shock. 3 sheriff's vehicles were parked in his yard. Beyond them, a small crowd had gathered at the edge of his property, neighbors and townspeople watching with undisguised curiosity. And at the very front of his driveway, a line of motorcycles gleamed in the morning sun. The lost riders had come. Frank watched in horror as Sheriff Callahan approached his porch, accompanied by a tall, bearded biker in a leather vest. Even after all these years, Frank recognized Dakota Johnson. They'd been at family reunions together as boys, before Vietnam, before everything fell apart. Frank's legs nearly gave out. Dakota was Cousin Roy's boy. Roy, who had been in Frank's unit. Roy, who had died in the ambush while Frank ran. The knock at the door was firm, authoritative. "Frank Miller," called Sheriff Callahan. "Need to speak with you. Open up." With shaking hands, Frank unlocked the door. As it swung open, he found himself face to face with the sheriff and the man whose father had died because of Frank's cowardice. "Hello, Frank," Dakota said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It's been a long time." Frank couldn't speak, couldn't move. This was punishment. Finally catching up to him after all these years. Not just for the puppy, but for everything. For Ajax. For Roy. For all of them. "Mr. Miller," Sheriff Callahan said formally, "we're here about a German Shepherd puppy that was found abandoned on County Road 22 2 weeks ago. Witnesses place you in the area around that time, and the puppy matches the description of one your grandchildren gave you recently." Frank's eyes darted from the sheriff to Dakota, then to the crowd beyond. He saw judgment in every face, saw his few remaining shreds of dignity dissolving before his eyes. "Frank," Dakota said, stepping closer, "we need to talk about Max." Something in Frank broke then. A dam holding back 50 years of guilt and shame. Without warning, he collapsed to his knees on the porch, his thin shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry," he wept, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "God help me, I'm sorry. For all of it. For Ajax, for Roy, for Max. I couldn't... The barking. It took me back there. I couldn't bear it." Dakota exchanged a shocked glance with the sheriff. This wasn't the defiant reaction they'd expected. This was a man coming apart at the seams. "Frank," Dakota said, kneeling beside the sobbing man, "let's take this inside." With surprising gentleness, Dakota and the sheriff helped Frank to his feet and guided him into the house. The gathered crowd murmured in disappointment as the door closed, cutting off their view of the drama unfolding inside. In Frank's cluttered living room, the old man sank into his armchair, his outburst leaving him drained and shaking. Dakota took a seat across from him, while Callahan remained standing, his expression uncomfortable. "How did you find out?" Frank asked hoarsely. "Gas station attendant heard you bragging about it," Dakota said. "We found Max half dead from dehydration. He's alive, by the way. One of my brothers is taking care of him." Frank closed his eyes, relief washing over his haggard features. Thank God. I've been seeing him in my nightmares, just like I still see Ajax. You mentioned Ajax, Dakota said carefully, and my father. Frank's eyes snapped open, filled with a lifetime of guilt. You know, don't you, about what happened that day? Dakota hesitated, then nodded. I've heard rumors that you broke under fire, that you left your post. I abandoned them, Frank whispered, the admission clearly causing him physical pain. Ajax started barking. He'd detected enemy movement. I should have given the alert, but I froze. When the shooting started, I ran. While your father and the others... He couldn't finish the sentence. Sheriff Callahan shifted uncomfortably. Frank, we're here about the dog. It's all connected, Frank interrupted, looking up with eyes that had seen too much horror. Don't you see? When Max wouldn't stop barking, it brought it all back. The sound. It was like I was right back there in that jungle, hearing Ajax before the ambush. I had a complete breakdown. Didn't take my meds for days. Started drinking instead. His voice dropped to a whisper. I thought if I got rid of the dog, the memories would stop, but they only got worse. Dakota studied the broken man before him, seeing not just a person who had abandoned a puppy, but a casualty of war, still fighting battles decades after the conflict had ended. The anger he'd nursed during their investigation began to transform into something more complex. Not quite forgiveness, but understanding. Frank, he said finally, what you did to Max was wrong. You could have called the shelter, called your daughter, called anyone. There were options besides leaving him to die on a county road. I know, Frank whispered. I know that now. And you need to face consequences for that, Dakota continued. But there's something else you should know about Max. He's special. That puppy is part of a breeding program for service dogs for veterans with PTSD. He was being raised to help people like you. Frank's face crumpled at this revelation. God, he moaned, I really am beyond redemption. Sheriff Callahan stepped forward. Mr. Miller, I need to place you under arrest for animal cruelty and abandonment. You have the right to remain silent. Hold on, Sheriff, Dakota interrupted. Before you do that, I think Frank needs to see something. He turned to the door and called out, Roscoe, bring him in. The door opened and Roscoe entered, gently cradling Max in his massive arms. The puppy had filled out in the past weeks, his coat gleaming with health. When he spotted Frank, his ears perked up, head tilting in recognition. Frank stared at the puppy, fresh tears spilling down his weathered cheeks. Max, he whispered. Roscoe approached cautiously and knelt before Frank's chair, still holding the puppy. He's doing real good now, the big biker said softly. Smart little guy, learning commands already. To everyone's surprise, Max squirmed in Roscoe's arms, clearly wanting to get closer to Frank. Hesitantly, Roscoe allowed the puppy to climb onto Frank's lap. Max immediately stood on his hind legs, front paws on Frank's chest, and licked the old man's tear-stained face. The simple act of forgiveness from the creature he had wronged broke something loose in Frank's soul. He gently wrapped his arms around the puppy, his entire body shaking with silent sobs. Dakota watched the scene with a lump in his throat. The plan he and his brothers had devised, confronting Frank publicly, ensuring he faced legal consequences, suddenly seemed inadequate. This wasn't just about justice for a puppy anymore. This was about healing wounds that had festered for half a century. Sheriff, Dakota said quietly, I think we need to reconsider our approach here. Callahan nodded slowly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Frank still needs to answer for what he did, but maybe there's a better way than just throwing him into cell. As the three men discussed options, with Max contentedly settled on Frank's lap, none of them noticed the black's SUV pulling up outside, or the well-dressed woman who emerged from it. her face a mixture of concern and determination. Emily Miller had come to check on her father, having received a disturbing call from a neighbor. What she found would change the trajectory of all their lives in ways none of them could have anticipated. Emily Miller pushed through the small crowd gathered at her father's property with determined steps. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had built a successful life despite difficult beginnings. Her stylish business attire stood in stark contrast to the worn jeans and flannel shirts of the onlookers. "Excuse me," she said firmly, making her way to the sheriff's deputy standing guard at the porch steps. "That's my father's house. I need to get inside." The deputy hesitated. "Ma'am, there's an ongoing investigation. My name is Emily Miller. That's my father's home, and those are police vehicles in his yard. Either you let me through right now, or I'll be calling the county commissioner, who happens to be a close personal friend." Something in her tone, perhaps the unmistakable edge of a daughter prepared to fight for her family regardless of circumstances, convinced the deputy to step aside. "They're in the living room, ma'am." Emily nodded curtly and climbed the familiar steps of her childhood home. The screen door creaked the same way it had for 30 years as she pulled it open. The scene that greeted her inside, however, was unlike anything she could have imagined. Her father, the proud, stubborn man who had raised her with a mixture of military discipline and awkward love, sat crumpled in his armchair, tears streaming down his face. A German shepherd puppy was curled in his lap. Sheriff Callahan stood by the window talking in low tones with a tall, bearded biker. Another mountain of a man with a leather vest sat cross-legged on the floor beside her father's chair. They all turned as she entered. "Emily," Frank whispered, looking simultaneously relieved and ashamed. "What are you doing here?" "Mrs. Torres called me," Emily replied, setting her purse down decisively. "Said there were police cars and motorcycles at your house. Said people were gathering to watch." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the strange tableau. "Would someone like to explain what's happening here?" Sheriff Callahan stepped forward. "Ms. Miller, I'm Sheriff Mike Callahan. We're here investigating a case of animal abandonment. This puppy was found abandoned on County Road 22 2 weeks ago, and evidence suggests your father was responsible." Emily's eyes widened as she looked at the puppy on her father's lap. Clearly, the same German shepherd her children had given him. "Dad, is this Max? You told me you gave him to another family." Frank couldn't meet her gaze. "I lied, Emmy. I left him on the side of the road." His voice cracked. "The barking, it was triggering my episodes. I wasn't thinking straight." Emily's face drained of color. For a moment she seemed unable to process what she was hearing. Then her professional composure cracked, giving way to raw emotion. "You abandoned him? Left him to die? How could you do that? After what we discussed when the kids gave him to you?" I know, Frank said, his shoulders shaking. "I've made so many mistakes, Emmy, so many." Dakota, who had been watching silently, cleared his throat. "Ms. Miller, I'm Dakota Johnson. I understand this is a family matter, but there's more to this situation than you might realize." Emily turned to him, her expression guarded. "And you are involved because—" "My club, the Lost Riders, found Max on the road. One of our members, Roscoe here, has been caring for him." Dakota gestured to the large man sitting near Frank's chair. "In the process of finding out who abandoned him, we discovered connections." "Connections?" Emily repeated. "Your father and my father served together in Vietnam," Dakota explained. "In the same unit. My father didn't make it home." Emily's gaze darted to her father, whose head had sunk even lower. "I don't understand what that has to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Frank interrupted, his voice suddenly stronger. He gently transferred Max to Roscoe's waiting hands and struggled to his feet. "Emily, there are things I've never told you, things I've never told anyone, but I can't carry it anymore." For the next 20 minutes, the room fell silent except for Frank's voice as he unburdened himself of secrets held for nearly 5 decades. He spoke of being a dog handler in Vietnam, of the ambush that killed most of his unit, of his panic and flight while others, including Dakota's father, fought and died. He spoke of the nightmares, the guilt, the slow poisoning of his soul through years of silence. Max wouldn't stop barking, he concluded, his voice ragged. It all came crashing back. I had a complete breakdown. Stopped taking my meds, started drinking heavily. In that state, I just wanted the barking to stop, wanted the memories to stop. He looked at his daughter with pleading eyes. I'm not making excuses. What I did was unforgivable. But I need you to understand, it wasn't just about a dog barking. It was about a broken man finally shattering completely. Emily had sunk onto the sofa during his confession, her anger gradually giving way to horror and then to a complex grief. This was a side of her father she had glimpsed only in fragments throughout her childhood, the night terrors, the occasional 1,000-yard stare, the silent periods that could last for days. Now, finally, the full picture was emerging, and it was more devastating than she had imagined. "Dad," she said softly when he had finished, "why didn't you tell me? All these years I knew something happened in Vietnam, but you never—" "How could I?" Frank's voice broke. "How could I tell my little girl that her father was a coward, that men died because I ran?" Dakota, who had listened intently to Frank's confession, stepped forward. "Frank, I need to tell you something." His voice was steady, but emotion flickered behind his eyes. "My father kept a journal during the war. My mother gave it to me when I was 21. He wrote about that day, about the ambush." Frank went rigid, his eyes wide with fear. "Dakota, please!" In his last entry, the night before the ambush, he wrote about you, about how you'd been struggling, how the jungle was wearing you down. He was worried about you. Dakota paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. But he also wrote that if anything happened to him, he wanted you to know he didn't blame you. He called you the best damn dog handler in the unit and said Ajax had saved their lives multiple times because of your training. Frank stared at Dakota in disbelief. "That can't be right. I abandoned them. I ran while they fought." "You broke under unimaginable pressure," Dakota corrected gently. "After months in hell, after seeing things no human should see. My father understood that. He didn't blame you." The revelation seemed to hit Frank like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair, one trembling hand covering his mouth. Sheriff Callahan, who had remained silent during these exchanges, cleared his throat. "This complicates things from a legal standpoint. What exactly are you planning to do with my father?" Emily asked, her professional demeanor reasserting itself. "He's clearly not well. He needs help, not punishment." "Animal abandonment is a crime," the sheriff reminded her. "But given the circumstances, I'm open to alternatives to standard prosecution." Dakota nodded. "I have a suggestion." He looked at Frank. "I called the VA while we were investigating, spoke with your doctor. He said you've missed your last 6 appointments." Frank shrugged helplessly. "Couldn't face it. Couldn't face any of it." "What if, instead of pressing charges," Dakota proposed, "we make a deal? Frank agrees to resume treatment, regular appointments, proper medication, therapy. He also agrees to community service with the local animal shelter." Roscoe, who had been quietly stroking Max, looked up. "And I have something to add." His deep voice was surprisingly soft. "The program Max was bred for, Canine Companions for Veterans, they're always looking for puppy raisers, people who help socialize and pre-train the puppies before their formal service training." Sheriff Callahan frowned. "You're suggesting Frank should raise dogs after what he did?" "Not alone," Roscoe clarified. "With supervision, with support. He looked at Frank with unexpected compassion. Sometimes the thing that breaks you is also the thing that can heal you. Max was triggering your PTSD, but a dog like Max, properly trained, could also help you manage it. Emily studied Roscoe with new interest. You sound like you know something about this. The big man nodded. Lost my wife and son in a car accident 8 years ago. Fell apart. Started drinking, fighting. Ended up doing time. He stroked Max's head gently. A prison program paired me with a service dog in training. Changed everything. Now, I volunteer with the program whenever I can. Frank stared at Roscoe and Max, a flicker of something, not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor, showing in his tired eyes. You think I could help train dogs for veterans? With the right support, Roscoe affirmed. You've got knowledge from your military experience. You understand what triggers vets because you live with it. Could be valuable. Sheriff Callahan considered this. It would need to be structured. Court-ordered treatment compliance, supervised community service, regular check-ins. I could help with that, Emily said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. I've been trying to get Dad to move closer to us in Tulsa for years. There's a small house for sale just down the street from us. If he were closer, I could ensure he makes his appointments, takes his medication. The kids could see their grandfather regularly. Frank looked startled. Emmy, I couldn't afford. Let me worry about that, she interrupted. My practice is doing well. Tim's business, too. We can help. A tentative plan began to form. Frank would sell his failing farm and move to Tulsa, near Emily's family. He would commit to regular VA treatment and medication. Instead of jail time, he would serve community service hours at a local animal shelter under Roscoe's supervision. Eventually, if his therapist approved, he might work with the Canine Companions program, using his experience to help train service dogs for other veterans. As they discussed details, Max wiggled free from Roscoe's gentle hold and returned to Frank's lap. The puppy yawned widely, then settled into a contented ball, apparently having decided that despite everything, this was where he belonged. Dakota watched the puppy's simple act of forgiveness with a thoughtful expression. Reaching into his vest pocket, he pulled out a worn leather wallet and extracted a yellowed photograph, which he handed to Frank. "That's you and my father," he said quietly. "Vietnam, 1972. On the back he wrote, 'Me and Frank with Ajax, best team in country.'" Frank stared at the photograph with trembling hands. 2 young men in jungle fatigues, grinning at the camera. A German shepherd sitting alertly between them. On the back, just as Dakota had said, was the inscription in faded blue ink. "I've carried that picture for 30 years, Dakota said. "Never knew if I'd find you. Never knew what I'd say if I did." He paused, emotion briefly tightening his voice. "Didn't expect it would be like this, but maybe it's fitting. Maybe Max brought us together to finally close this circle." Outside, the crowd of onlookers had begun to disperse, disappointed that the expected drama of an arrest had not materialized. The lost riders remained, a protective presence around the property, keeping curious neighbors at bay. Inside the house, an unlikely group continued their conversation. A sheriff, a businessman's daughter, 2 aging bikers, a troubled veteran, and a German shepherd puppy who had unwittingly become the catalyst for healing wounds 5 decades in the making. For Frank Miller, whose world had shrunk to the size of his grief and guilt, the room suddenly seemed full of possibilities he had long ago stopped believing in: forgiveness, purpose, connection, even redemption. When Sheriff Callahan finally stood to leave 2 hours later, the formal agreement had been drafted. Frank would appear before the judge the following week to enter his plea and accept the terms of his alternative sentencing. Dakota and Roscoe would serve as character witnesses. Emily would present the plan for her father's rehabilitation and care. "This isn't how I expected this to go," Callahan admitted as he prepared to address the remaining onlookers. "But sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about making things right." Dakota nodded, clapping the sheriff on the shoulder. Sometimes healing one wound helps heal others you didn't even know were still bleeding. As the men walked out onto the porch, Frank remained in his chair, Max now sleeping peacefully in his lap. Emily knelt beside him, her hand covering his. "We'll get through this, Dad," she promised. "One day at a time." Frank nodded, his eyes still fixed on the photograph Dakota had given him. For the first time in nearly 50 years, he allowed himself to remember not just the horror of that last day, but all the days before. The camaraderie, the moments of connection amid the chaos, the knowledge that he had once been part of something meaningful. "Maybe," he whispered, gently stroking Max's soft fur, "maybe it's not too late after all." The fragile peace constructed in Frank's living room shattered 3 days later. The carefully negotiated agreement, treatment, community service, a move to Tulsa, had seemed like a path forward, a way to balance justice with compassion. But as Sheriff Callahan would later observe, healing isn't a straight line. Sometimes you gotta hit rock bottom before you can start climbing up. That rock bottom came on a rain-soaked Wednesday morning. Emily had returned to Tulsa the previous day to prepare for her father's eventual relocation, leaving Frank with strict instructions to take his medication and keep his appointment with the VA doctor that afternoon. Dakota had arranged for different members of the Lost Riders to check in on Frank twice daily, ensuring he wasn't alone for long periods. It was Mac, the former Army medic, who had the morning shift. He arrived at Frank's farmhouse at 10, motorcycle rumbling up the muddy driveway through a steady drizzle. The house stood silent, curtains drawn despite the gloomy day. Mac knocked once, then again more forcefully when no answer came. "Frank, it's Mac from the Riders. Just checking in, brother." The silence that answered him sent a chill up his spine that had nothing to do with the cool rain seeping through his leather jacket. Instincts honed by years of combat and emergency medicine kicked in as he tried the door handle. It turned easily under his grip. "Frank," Mac called again, pushing the door open slowly. "You decent? Coming in?" The living room was empty, littered with empty whiskey bottles that hadn't been there the previous evening. On the coffee table lay an open photo album, several pictures removed and arranged in a careful row. Beside them, Frank's VA medication bottles stood in a neat line, all empty. "Ah, Christ," Mac muttered, dread pooling in his stomach as he moved quickly through the house. "Frank? Where are you, man?" The bathroom was empty. So was the kitchen. Mac took the narrow stairs 2 at a time, checking the bedrooms with increasing urgency. Nothing. Returning downstairs, he noticed for the first time a sheet of paper propped against the photo album. Frank's handwriting, normally precise from years of military reports, was shaky but legible. "Emily, Dakota, Sheriff Callahan. I appreciate what you all tried to do for me, but some stains don't wash out. Some failures can't be fixed with therapy and good intentions. I've lived with what I did to my unit, to Ajax, and now to Max. For too long. I'm tired. Dakota, your father was a better man than I could ever be. The photo I left for you shows him receiving his Silver Star. He should have come home to watch you grow up. I should have been the one who stayed behind. Emily, you and the kids deserve better than a broken old man dragging down your perfect life. The farm is paid off, deeds in the fireproof box in my closet. Sell it, use the money for the kids' college fund. Tell Roscoe to take good care of Max. He deserves a good life with someone who won't betray him. Frank Miller, SGT, U.S. Army, Ret. No, Mac growled, pulling out his phone and dialing Dakota with one hand while continuing to search the house. The call connected just as Mac's gaze fell on the back door, slightly ajar despite the rain. Through the window, he could just make out the silhouette of the old barn at the back of the property. Dakota, get to Frank's now. Bring Roscoe. I think he's trying to kill himself. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the path to the barn into treacherous mud that sucked at Mac's boots as he ran. The barn door was padlocked, but a side entrance stood open, an invitation Mac didn't hesitate to accept. The interior was dim, the only light filtering through gaps in the weathered boards. The sweet smell of hay mingled with the mustier odors of old motor oil and damp earth. Mac's eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, scanning the shadowy recesses until... Frank, Jesus Christ! The old veteran hung from a rafter, a rope around his neck, his body turning slightly in the draft from the open door. A toppled chair lay on its side beneath his feet. Mac lunged forward, medic training overriding the horror of the scene. He grabbed Frank around the waist, lifting to relieve the pressure on his neck while frantically feeling for a pulse with his free hand. "Frank, can you hear me? Frank!" A faint, thready pulse answered his probing fingers. Frank's face was bluish, but not the deep purple of prolonged oxygen deprivation. His eyelids fluttered weakly. "Stay with me, old man," Mac urged, struggling to maintain his grip while reaching for the pocket knife he always carried. "Don't you dare clock out now, not after everything." With painful slowness, Mac managed to extract his knife and cut through the rope while still supporting Frank's weight. They collapsed together onto the barn floor, Frank's breathing ragged and labored, but definitely there. "Ambulance!" Mac gasped, fumbling for his phone with shaking hands. "Just hang on, Frank. Help's coming." Dakota and Roscoe arrived minutes before the ambulance, guided by the flashing emergency lights Mac had placed at the entrance to Frank's property. They found Mac in the barn, kneeling beside Frank's still form, performing rescue breathing whenever Frank's own efforts faltered. "Jesus!" Dakota breathed, taking in the cut rope still dangling from the rafter. "He's alive," Mac reported without pausing his ministrations. "But barely. Found him just in time." Roscoe stood frozen in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the gray daylight. "Does Emily know?" Dakota shook his head. "Called her on the way. She's driving back now." He knelt opposite Mac, taking one of Frank's cold hands in his own. "You stubborn old fool," he muttered, his gruff voice catching. "This wasn't part of the deal." The paramedics arrived in a flurry of efficient movement, gently pushing the bikers aside to work on Frank. Oxygen mask, IV line, cardiac monitoring, each intervention pulling Frank incrementally back from the precipice he had willingly approached. "Attempted hanging," the lead paramedic reported into her radio. "Male subject, approximately 70 years old, found responsive but with decreasing level of consciousness. Possible medication overdose complicating presentation." She glanced at Mac. "You said you found empty pill bottles?" Mac nodded grimly. "VA prescriptions. Looks like he took everything he had." The gravity of this information registered in the tightening of the paramedic's lips. "We need to move now. County General's got the best poison control unit." As they loaded Frank into the ambulance, Dakota turned to Roscoe. "Mac, it's Boomer at the clubhouse," Roscoe answered, naming another member of their group. "Should I bring him?" Dakota considered this. "Not yet. Let's see how things play out at the hospital first." His weathered face was uncharacteristically vulnerable as he watched the ambulance doors close. "I never thought, when we found that puppy, I was ready to tear apart whoever left him there. Now—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the complex emotions churning inside him. Sheriff Callahan arrived as the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing but sirens silent, a detail that struck Dakota as profoundly sad. Even in this desperate moment, Frank Miller wasn't urgent enough to warrant a siren. "How bad?" Callahan asked simply. "Bad," Dakota confirmed. "Mac found him hanging in the barn. He'd taken all his meds, too." The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I should have put a deputy on him. Should have seen this coming." "We all should have," Dakota admitted heavily. "Man confesses to 50 years of guilt and trauma. We think a few conversations and a care plan will fix it." He shook his head bitterly. "We were naive. The three men stood in silence for a moment, rain soaking their shoulders, each lost in his own thoughts. Finally Roscoe spoke, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "So what now? If he makes it, I mean." It was a question none of them had a ready answer for. Their carefully constructed plan, community service, supervised care, eventual work with service dogs, had been predicated on a Frank who was damaged but willing to heal. This desperate act changed everything. Step at a time," Dakota said finally. "First, he survives, then we figure out the rest." He turned to Callahan. "This doesn't change my testimony at the hearing. If anything, it reinforces that Frank needs help, not punishment." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I'll call the DA, explain the situation, but Frank's still looking at consequences for what he did to that puppy. This," he gestured toward the barn, "complicates things, but it doesn't erase them." "No one's asking for a ratio," Dakota said firmly, "just humanity." As they prepared to follow the ambulance to County General, Mac emerged from Frank's house, the suicide note and photo album carefully preserved in a plastic bag to protect them from the rain. "Found these by his bed," Mac said, handing Dakota a small velvet pouch. "Military medals. Figure Emily might want them." Dakota accepted the pouch, its weight in his palm a tangible reminder of the man Frank had once been and, perhaps, if they were lucky, could be again. But first, Frank would have to survive not just his physical injuries, but the deeper wounds that had driven him to this desperate act. As they mounted their motorcycles, Roscoe paused, looking back at the dilapidated farmhouse and the barn where they'd nearly lost Frank for good. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in the old stories, it's always darkest before dawn." Dakota nodded, kick-starting his Harley with a roar that seemed to defy the somber mood. "Then let's go make sure Frank lives to see the sunrise." The fluorescent lights of County General's ICU waiting room cast harsh shadows across Emily Miller's face as she sat rigidly in an uncomfortable plastic chair. She had made the 3-hour drive from Tulsa in just under 2, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her fingers now ached. Across from her, Dakota Johnson occupied a similar chair, his large frame making the standard hospital furniture seem comically small. "They've pumped his stomach," Emily said, breaking a silence that had stretched for nearly 20 minutes. "Started him on activated charcoal for the medication overdose, but they're more worried about brain damage from oxygen deprivation." Dakota nodded, his weathered face grave. Mac found him quickly. "That's something." Emily's composure, maintained through the frantic drive, through the hospital admissions process, through the initial barrage of medical information, finally cracked. "How did I miss this? I'm a clinical psychologist, for God's sake. I work with trauma patients. How did I not see my own father was this close to—" Her voice broke. "You can't blame yourself," Dakota said quietly. "Frank's been hiding his pain for 50 years. He's had a lot of practice. But I knew about the PTSD. I knew about the nightmares, the drinking. I should have pushed harder when he told me he'd given Max away. I knew something wasn't right." Dakota leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Emily, listen to me. When my father died in Vietnam, my mother fell apart, started drinking, couldn't hold down a job. Child Services got involved. By 15, I was in my 3rd foster home." He paused, gathering thoughts, clearly painful to articulate. "For decades, I blamed her for being weak, for not pulling herself together for my sake. It took me until my 40s to understand that grief and trauma aren't rational. They don't follow the rules of what should happen." Emily studied him, professional interest momentarily overriding her personal anguish. "When did you finally understand?" "And I found my father's journal. Reading his words, seeing Vietnam through his eyes, I finally got a glimpse of what my mother had lost." He shook his head slowly. "And I realized something else. My father never blamed Frank for what happened during the ambush. He understood that war breaks people in different ways. Some die in the moment. Others carry the dying home with them. Before Emily could respond, the double doors to the ICU opened. Dr. Patel, the neurologist assigned to Frank's case, approached with measured steps. Both Emily and Dakota rose to meet her. "Ms. Miller," the doctor acknowledged, "we've completed our initial assessment." "How is he?" Emily asked, steeling herself for the worst. "Your father is stable but critical," Dr. Patel explained. "The good news is that he was found relatively quickly after the hanging attempt, which limited the hypoxic injury, the damage from lack of oxygen. However, combined with a medication overdose, his system has undergone significant trauma." "What does that mean long-term?" Dakota asked. Dr. Patel's expression was carefully neutral. "It's too early to make definitive prognosis. Your father is currently in a coma, Ms. Miller. This is partly due to the medications we've administered to protect his brain and partly due to the injury itself. Over the next 72 hours, we'll begin to have a clearer picture of the extent of damage and his chances for recovery." Emily nodded, her professional training helping her process the clinical information even as her heart raced with fear. "Can I see him?" "Briefly," Dr. Patel agreed. "One visitor at a time, 5 minutes maximum. He's on a ventilator and has multiple IV lines, so prepare yourself for that." As Emily followed the doctor through the double doors, Dakota returned to his seat, extracting his phone to update the other riders waiting anxiously for news. Roscoe had gone to pick up Sheriff Callahan, who had needed to finish processing the scene at Frank's farm before coming to the hospital. The rest of the club had established a rotation, ensuring that someone would always be present in the waiting room. A silent vigil for a man most of them had only recently met. Inside the ICU, Emily fought to maintain her composure as she approached her father's bed. Frank looked diminished somehow, swallowed up by medical equipment. A ventilator tube obscured part of his face. Cardiac monitors beeped a steady rhythm. IV lines delivered fluids and medications. His wrists were restrained against the bed rails. "Standard protocol for suicide attempts," Dr. Patel had explained gently. Emily took her father's hand, careful not to disturb the IV. His skin felt cool and paper-thin beneath her fingers. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Frank's eyes remained closed, his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm with the ventilator. Emily found herself cataloging the changes in his face. Deeper lines around his mouth, more pronounced hollows beneath his eyes, gray stubble on cheeks that had always been meticulously clean-shaven when she was growing up. How long had he been deteriorating? How many signs had she missed? "Miss Miller," a nurse said softly from behind her, "your time is up for now. You can come back in an hour." Emily nodded, reluctantly releasing her father's hand. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of a small whiteboard mounted on the wall near Frank's bed. In the space marked patient goals, someone had written simply, "Breathe on own, wake up, heal." Such modest ambitions for a man who had once commanded troops in battle, who had raised a daughter alone after his wife's death, who had carved a hard-scrabble existence from an unforgiving piece of Oklahoma earth. Now, success would be measured in automated breaths becoming voluntary ones. The gravity of her father's condition hit Emily anew as she pushed through the double doors back into the waiting area. She found it now populated not just by Dakota, but by Roscoe, Sheriff Callahan, and another biker she didn't recognize. "How is he?" Roscoe asked, his deep voice hushed in deference to the hospital setting. Emily shook her head slightly. "It's a lot. The doctor says the next 3 days are critical." The unknown biker stepped forward, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Mike. I'm the one who found your dad." Emily took his hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said fervently. "If you hadn't checked on him when you did—" "I've seen enough men die," Mac said simply. "Wasn't about to let another go if I could help it." Sheriff Callahan cleared his throat. "Emily, I need to discuss some things with you regarding your father's legal situation." Dakota frowned. "Now, really, Mike?" "It can't wait," the sheriff insisted, though his tone was apologetic. "The hearing's still scheduled for tomorrow. Given the circumstances, I've spoken with the DA, but I need some information from Emily to proceed." Emily squared her shoulders, compartmentalizing her emotional turmoil to address this new challenge. "Of course, Sheriff, whatever you need." They moved to a quieter corner of the waiting room while Dakota, Roscoe, and Mac conversed in low tones by the vending machines. "The DA is willing to postpone the hearing in light of your father's condition," Callahan explained. "But they need documentation from his doctors confirming that he's medically unable to appear." Emily nodded. "I can get that from Dr. Patel." "There's something else." The sheriff hesitated. "Your father's suicide attempt. It complicates things. On one hand, it demonstrates extreme remorse, which works in his favor. On the other hand, it raises serious concerns about his mental stability and whether he can be trusted with the kind of arrangement we discussed." "What are you saying?" Emily asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm saying that even once he recovers physically, if he recovers, the court may mandate inpatient psychiatric treatment rather than the outpatient care and community service we proposed." Callahan's expression was genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry, Emily. I wanted this to work out differently." Emily closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this new reality. "So, instead of coming to live near me in Tulsa, he'd be committed to a psychiatric facility?" "Potentially, yes, at least initially." A wave of exhaustion swept over Emily. How had everything unraveled so quickly? Just 4 days ago they had been crafting a thoughtful plan for her father's rehabilitation, a second chance that balanced accountability with compassion. Now he lay tethered to machines, fighting for his life, with the prospect of institutionalization looming beyond that battle. "Sheriff," she said finally, "right now my only concern is whether my father will wake up. We can deal with the legal implications once we know he's going to survive." Callahan nodded, respecting her boundaries. "Of course. I'll tell the DA we need to postpone indefinitely, pending medical updates." As the sheriff stepped away to make his call, Emily found herself suddenly flanked by Roscoe's imposing presence. The big biker didn't speak immediately, simply offering a cup of vending machine coffee that she accepted gratefully. "I brought something," Roscoe said after she had taken a few sips. "Thought it might help." From inside his leather vest he produced a small photograph. Frank, in his military uniform, kneeling beside a German shepherd. The dog sat at perfect attention, alert and proud. "Where did you get this?" Emily asked, taking the photo carefully. "It was at your dad's place, on his bedside table, separate from the other pictures." Roscoe paused. "That's Ajax, isn't it? His military dog?" Emily nodded. "Dad rarely spoke about him, but he kept this picture all these years." She studied the image more closely. "He looks so young here, so unburdened." "War changes everyone who touches it," Roscoe said quietly, "dogs included. Ajax died saving your dad's unit, from what Dakota told me. And Dad never forgave himself for surviving when Ajax and his teammates didn't." Emily handed the photo back. "Keep this safe, please. I think he'd want to see it when he wakes up." Roscoe accepted the picture with careful hands. "When, not if. I like that thinking." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the entrance to the waiting room. A nurse had appeared, looking harried. "Is there a Mr. Thompson here, Roscoe Thompson?" Roscoe raised his hand. Hey, that's me." "Sir, you can't have animals in the hospital. Your friend is outside with a dog, insisting you authorized it." Roscoe and Dakota exchanged alarmed glances. "Max," Dakota muttered. "Who brought him here?" "I'll handle this," Roscoe assured the nurse, following her toward the exit. could explain to Emily. "Must be one of the younger riders thinking they were helping. We've been caring for Max at our clubhouse." Emily bit her lip. "The puppy my kids gave Dad. I almost forgot about him with everything happening." "Roscoe's been taking good care of him," Dakota assured her. "The little guy is doing great, putting on weight, learning commands." Outside, they could hear Roscoe's deep voice engaged in conversation, followed by the appearance of the big biker in the doorway, holding Max securely in his arms. The German Shepherd puppy had indeed filled out in the weeks since his abandonment, his coat glossy and healthy. "They're making an exception," Roscoe announced, returning to their corner, "since he's in training as a therapy dog. Had to promise he'd stay only in the waiting room, though." Emily reached out tentatively to stroke Max's head. The puppy sniffed her hand, then licked it enthusiastically. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "My kids will be thrilled to see him when they arrive tomorrow." As if sensing the gravity of the situation, Max settled calmly in Roscoe's lap when the big man sat down. His alert eyes scanned the room, occasionally returning to the double doors of the ICU, as if he somehow knew that beyond them lay the man who had once been his owner. "It's strange," Dakota mused, watching the puppy. "This all started because Frank couldn't handle Max's barking. Now, in a way, Max might be part of what helps him heal." Emily nodded slowly. "If he gets the chance to heal." The unspoken question hung heavily in the air, accompanied only by the quiet whirring of vending machines and the muffled sounds of the hospital beyond. For Frank Miller, the journey from darkness toward light had only just begun, and none of them, not his daughter, not his cousin's son, not the sheriff or the bikers or the patient puppy, could predict where that path would ultimately lead. What they could do, however, was ensure that he wouldn't walk it alone. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Frank Miller's small guest house, casting golden stripes across the kitchen table where he sat with his morning coffee. 6 months had passed since his release from the hospital, and almost a year since that fateful day when he'd abandoned Max on County Road 22. The German Shepherd now lay at his feet, no longer a clumsy puppy but a sleek, disciplined animal wearing a training vest from the Canine Companions for Veterans program. "Ready for the big day, boy?" Frank asked, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. The dog looked up attentively, his dark eyes seeming to reflect an understanding beyond mere animal intelligence. The cottage Emily had built for him at the back of her property in Tulsa provided the perfect balance. Close enough for family support, yet private enough to maintain his independence. Through the window, Frank could see his grandchildren playing in the yard, their laughter a sound he'd once thought he would never deserve to hear again. The court had been surprisingly lenient, influenced by the testimony of Dakota, Roscoe, and even Sheriff Callahan. Frank's sentence had included mandatory psychiatric treatment, 200 hours of community service at the local animal shelter, and a requirement to continue working with the Veterans Therapy Dog Program. What had begun as a punishment had evolved into something close to salvation. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Frank stood, joints protesting slightly, some damage from his suicide attempt had left permanent effects, and opened the door to find Dakota and Roscoe standing on his porch. "Morning, Frank," Dakota greeted him, the early light gleaming on his silver hair. "Truck's all loaded up, ready to head out?" Today marked the official opening of the Lost Riders Service Dog Training Center, a project that had grown from a simple community service arrangement into a full-fledged nonprofit. Frank had been instrumental in its development, leveraging his military dog handling experience alongside Roscoe's natural talent with animals. The center would train service dogs specifically for veterans suffering from PTSD, with a focus on rescuing abandoned animals when possible, giving second chances all around. "Just need my jacket," Frank replied, reaching for the navy blue staff shirt hanging by the door. The embroidered patch on the breast pocket read, "Lead Trainer," a position he still couldn't quite believe he held. Max rose and shook himself, tail wagging at the sight of Roscoe, who had been his primary caretaker during Frank's hospitalization. The big biker knelt to greet the dog, his massive hands gentle as they checked the fit of Max's training vest. "He's looking sharp today," Roscoe commented. Figured he should look his best, being the program's inspiration and all. As they drove to the center, located on land donated by a local veteran-owned business, Frank gazed out the window at the passing landscape. His mind drifted back to the day he'd awakened in the hospital, expecting to find himself alone and reviled. Instead, he'd opened his eyes to find Emily dozing in a chair beside his bed, Dakota reading a magazine in the corner, and a handmade card from his grandchildren propped on the bedside table. The road to recovery had been arduous. Physical therapy for the damage to his throat and neck, intensive psychiatric treatment for the PTSD he'd ignored for 50 years, the humiliation of facing a judge and admitting to animal cruelty. There had been setbacks and dark days when the old demons returned, but for the first time since Vietnam, Frank hadn't faced those battles alone. "You're quiet today," Dakota observed, glancing at Frank from the driver's seat. "Having second thoughts?" Frank shook his head. "Just thankful. Never thought I'd see a day like this again." Dakota nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation. Their shared connection to the past, to Roy Johnson and that fateful day in Vietnam, had evolved into something neither man could have anticipated. Not quite friendship, not quite family, but a bond forged through trauma and healing that seemed, in its way, unbreakable. The training center came into view as they crested a hill, a renovated barn and outbuildings on 20 acres of land. Already cars filled the makeshift parking area, and a small crowd had gathered near the main entrance, where red, white, and blue bunting decorated a makeshift stage. Frank spotted Emily's sedan and felt a surge of pride. His daughter had become an advocate for animal-assisted therapy in her professional practice, presenting their family story at conferences and penning articles for psychology journals. Her support had never wavered, even during his darkest moments of recovery. As they parked, Sheriff Callahan approached, looking uncharacteristically casual in jeans and a button-down shirt, though his badge still gleamed on his belt. "Frank, Dakota," he greeted them with handshakes. "Place looks great. County commissioners are impressed. They're talking about increasing the budget allocation for next year already." The strange alliance between the sheriff and the Lost Riders had confounded the local community initially, but had gradually come to be accepted as both groups found common ground in supporting veterans' causes. Callahan had become an unexpected champion for the program, advocating for funding and speaking openly about alternative approaches to justice when circumstances warranted. "Didn't think I'd see the day when you'd be driving budget increases for a bunch of bikers, Mike," Dakota teased, clapping the sheriff on the shoulder. "Results speak for themselves," Callahan replied simply. 3 veterans diverted from jail to this program in the last 4 months alone, all doing better than they would behind bars. The ceremony was mercifully brief. Local officials made short speeches, a ribbon was cut, and tours of the facility began. Frank found himself stationed in the training arena, demonstrating with Max how service dogs could be taught to recognize and respond to anxiety attacks, nightmares, and other PTSD symptoms. As he worked with Max, showing a small group how the dog could apply gentle pressure during a panic attack, Frank caught sight of a familiar face at the back of the crowd. Dr. Lauren Wilson, his VA therapist, who had stuck with him through the grueling months of recovery. She gave him an encouraging nod, and he felt a surge of gratitude for the network of support that had gradually assembled around him. "The key," Frank explained to the attentive group, "is understanding that the dog isn't just responding to commands. They are building a relationship with their handler. Max knows when I'm heading into a bad place before I do sometimes." He demonstrated a subtle hand signal, and Max immediately pressed his body against Frank's legs, a grounding technique that had pulled Frank back from the edge of flashbacks countless times. After the demonstrations concluded and the crowd began to disperse toward the refreshment tables, Frank found a quiet moment to slip away to the small memorial garden they'd created behind the main building. Here, alongside plaques honoring service dogs who had died in the line of duty, stood a simple stone marker for Ajax, Frank's canine partner. From kneeling before it, Frank placed a single dog tag, a replica of the one Ajax had worn, which Dakota had helped him obtain through military connections. "Thought I might find you here," came Dakota's voice from behind him. Frank rose slowly, knees protesting. "Just paying respects." Dakota nodded, his eyes moving to the memorial. "My father would be proud, you know, of all this, of you." "I'm not so sure about that," Frank replied, the old guilt never entirely absent. "I am," Dakota said firmly. "He wrote about you in his journal, said you were one of the best dog handlers he'd ever seen, said Ajax saved their lives a dozen times because of your training." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "He also wrote that the jungle was wearing you down, that he was worried about you. He understood, Frank." Even then, Frank absorbed this in silence, the weight of it settling into the spaces where guilt had lived for so long, not erasing it entirely, but transforming it somehow into something he could carry. "Your father was a better man than me," he said finally. "Maybe," Dakota conceded, "or maybe you're finally becoming the man you were always meant to be before the war broke something inside you." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two aging men with a shared history that had taken half a century to reconcile. Max padded over to sit between them, his presence a living bridge between past and present. The sound of children's laughter broke the solemn moment as Timmy and Sarah came running around the corner of the building, followed by Emily calling after them to slow down. "Grandpa!" Timmy shouted, launching himself at Frank with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood. "Did you see us in the audience? We had special seats up front." "I sure did," Frank replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "What did you think of Max's demonstration?" "He was the best dog there," Sarah declared loyally, dropping to her knees to hug the German shepherd around the neck. Max submitted to the embrace with dignified patience, his training allowing him to distinguish between work mode and family time. Emily approached more sedately, her professional demeanor softened by the pride evident in her eyes. "The director of the VA hospital was impressed, Dad. He's talking about establishing a permanent relationship with the center for their inpatient PTSD program." Frank nodded, still sometimes overwhelmed by how far things had come. From the depths of his despair in that barn a year ago to this moment of unexpected purpose, it was a journey he could never have envisioned. As the family made their way back to the main celebration, Frank felt a sense of completion he had not experienced since before Vietnam. The nightmares hadn't stopped entirely, the guilt still visited in quiet moments, but now, surrounded by the unlikely family he had found, his daughter and grandchildren, Dakota and the Lost Riders, Max and the other dogs in training, Frank Miller had finally found a way to come home. Later that evening, as sunset painted the Oklahoma sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a line of motorcycles thundered down a country road not far from where Max had once been abandoned. Leading the formation was Frank on a used Harley that Dakota had helped him purchase, Max securely fitted in a custom sidecar designed by Roscoe. Behind them rode the Lost Riders, their leather vests now bearing patches that read, "Veteran Service Dog Program." For the first time in 50 years, Frank Miller rode toward the horizon not to escape his past, but to meet a future he had never dared to imagine. Rometry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. When life has weathered you like an old barn standing against decades of Oklahoma storms, it's easy to believe your best days are behind you. Frank Miller thought his mistakes, both in Vietnam and with that German shepherd puppy, had defined him beyond redemption. Many of us carry similar burdens, regrets that haunt our sleep, words we can't take back, moments when courage failed us. But Frank's story reminds us that even in our twilight years, healing is possible. Those lost riders, men who'd seen their share of hardship, understood something profound. No one is ever too broken to be worth saving. They recognized in Frank not just a man who'd abandoned a puppy, but a fellow veteran still fighting a war that had officially ended 50 years ago. The road to forgiveness, both giving and receiving it, isn't straight or easy. It runs through pain, through confronting the darkest parts of ourselves. But, as Frank discovered in that hospital room, surrounded by unlikely allies, it's never too late to find your way home, the family you build in your later years. Through reconciliation, through shared understanding, through simple acts of compassion, can be just as meaningful as the one you were born into.